Hello again. This is now the second part of lecture number 19, Rome and Sasanid Persia for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World. And we left off last time having discussed and talked a little bit about Roman culture and society during this period. And what I'd like to do now is step back and talk about the evolution of politics and how the Roman Empire politically changed over the next several centuries. And this is, of course, an extremely interesting question because it covers really the high point and the beginning of a gradual decline in Rome as it aged, as it enters sort of its middle age as an empire, that we might say. So we left off last time by talking about our friend Emperor Hadrian, the fellow who built Hadrian's Wall in England and things like that. And Hadrian's a very interesting character, and I noted he's the first Roman emperor where we start seeing beards a lot on these emperors, which is an interesting development, because from this point onward, most of the Roman emperors are going to have beards, and previously they tended not to. And that's kind of an interesting change, and that's an interesting point. So, but in any event, that's a thing to think about. Anyway, Hadrian was succeeded by a guy named Antoninus Pius. Antoninus Pius reigned from 138 to 161 AD, and he was autocrat, that is to say he ruled with sort of an iron fist, but a benevolent iron fist. So he was not one to brook anyone getting in his way or disagreeing with him or anything like that, but at the same time he didn't want to do harm. He was trying to do a good job. He was just thinking, I'm going to do it my way. It's my way or the highway, but he did try to do a good job. And some people, some historians, for example, our friend Edward Gibbon, have said this was it. This was the high point of the Roman Empire. Now, of course, it's hard to say when the high point came because, of course, it's a big, complicated place, but this was certainly a time when Rome was supreme and powerful, and things were going pretty well in general for the Romans here, in general. But keep something in mind. Always remember what your old professor here has said. When times are good, when things seem to be going well, is the time to be most careful. You have to plan ahead. You cannot assume good times are going to last forever. And human societies throughout history have made this mistake, including our own. Including our own. Times when the economy of the United States has been booming and everything's going great and unemployment is low and things are going really well are the very times we should be saving our money, should be stashing things away, should be preparing for trouble. Because as we've seen with this coronavirus thing, things can change really fast. They can go from being really good to really bad. Unemployment can go from record lows to record highs in literally a month and a half, and it has. So we need to always remember, both personally and individually and as a society, to prepare for tough times during good times. But of course, human beings don't tend to do that. What do? We party. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I like to have fun too, and so this means I don't always plan ahead as well as I should either. And so this is something to keep in mind. Right? This is something to keep in mind. So the Romans during these good times, were they planning for the future? Were they anticipating rough times ahead? That's an interesting sort of question here. An interesting sort of question. Now, during this time, by this time, the Roman army is no longer the mean, lean, conquering machine it had once been back in the days of the late Republic. It is now focused on defending the empire. It is a purely defensive stance. We're never going to get any bigger, they said. We're never going to make this empire any bigger. We've got to simply hold the line. And that makes a certain amount of sense, because there is a limit to how big a country can get, especially in the pre-modern era when you don't have telegraphs and railroads and airplanes and all those other goodies we have today that allow us to have big countries, right? They didn't have that. They had the Mediterranean Sea, and that helped communications, and that helped hold things together. But there really wasn't any way the Roman Empire was going to get any bigger, so sending the army out to conquer new territory was a waste of time. All right, that just isn't going to work. All right, so what does this mean? The army is now set in forward bases along the border, along the frontier, especially the long northern frontier with those various German tribes and groups like that on the north, and then of course their eastern frontier. That's got the problem of the Persians, the Parthians, and eventually the Sasanians, as we'll see. So this is an interesting sort of thing. The Sahara Desert provides a nice southern border, and it's not that you don't have to put too many troops down there. Just keep some of those crazy nomads from getting out of control, and you're okay down there. And of course, if you get further east, you run out of land, so you don't have a problem over there. So that was kind of their border. So the big northern border is their big defensive problem. And this is what they're going to have to deal with. How are you going to deal with them? Well, these Germanic tribes in the north are really potentially a problem. You can't conquer them. You can't destroy them. You've got to simply constantly deal with them. They're a problem of constant management here. And how do you do this? Well, you use a variety of things. Sometimes you send in the troops, you punch them in the nose, you make sure they know you're tough. Sometimes you pay them off. That's often worthwhile. If you don't want to send the troops in, you can pay them off. And sometimes, and a most effective way, is you try to figure a way to make them more like you. Because that's the thing. The more like you they are, the less likely they're going to want to mess up you and your system, and more likely they're going to want to get involved, be part of it. And so this is a way the Romans could try to do this. And this happens slowly. This is never something you can do overnight. But you do this slowly, and this is probably not even a planned strategy. But over time, these Germanic tribes, some of them would start to get more and more Romanized. They'd act more and more like the Romans, and they wouldn't necessarily invade and cause trouble. But there's a problem. And the problem is this. There's always some group behind that group. Behind the German tribes are some other groups. And those groups are wild and woolly and barbarians, and they're going to be pressing against the Germans who are going to push against the Romans. And it's going to be kind of a domino effect. I had a professor many years ago. He was a very, very fine history professor, and he talked about this when we talked about the Roman world. And he had a theory, and it was a crackpot theory. He admitted it. It was not true, but it was a good way to illustrate this point. He said, here's the thing. I think somewhere in the middle of Asia is a giant trap door. And every few hundred years, it opens up and a few million people pour out of the trap door, and then it closes again. And those people push against the people already there, who push against the people next to them, who push against the people next to them, and eventually the people get pushed all the way against either Rome, or in this case, also China. China has this same problem. Barbarians sort of to their north. And it's an interesting theory. It's totally crackpot, of course. We've never found any such trapdoor in Central Asia, but it does illustrate the point that migrations of different groups of people in the Asian continent that we know almost nothing about because they didn't write anything down, and so we know almost nothing about these. But these migrations are going to have real impacts on empires like the Roman Empire and, of course, the Chinese Empire further to the east, not to mention people in the Middle East and the Persia and that area. So this is something to keep in mind. The trapdoor may not be true, but the movement of those people was. And one of the groups of people that is going to be doing this are a group of people called the Goths. Now, today the term Goth is often used to be referring to a particular kind of people who like to wear interesting outfits and a lot of facial makeup and that sort of thing. That's different from the Goths I'm talking about here. These Goths were basically a barbarian group who would press against the Romans, and they would start causing problems. Right? And they're a new group in this period, and they're starting to push against the border of the Roman Empire. And that means the Romans have to figure a way to try and defend the northern border. And that's going to be tough because it's very long. The other threat, of course, is the east, and that is to say the Parthians, and eventually after the Parthians, the Sasanian Persians. That is to say the old bugaboo of the Persians, the Iranians. And these guys are also pressing against the Roman Empire because what they want more than anything else is access to the Mediterranean and all the wonderful trade routes that goes with that. And so the Romans have to keep troops on the eastern border to keep the Parthians and then the Sasanian Persians out and keep them under control as well. And those are the two big foreign policy problems that the Roman Empire is going to have in this period. All right? Now, until the middle of about the 3rd century AD, the empire did pretty well at defending itself against these problems, against these various barbarian groups and the Sasanian and the Parthian Persians. So this was something. All right? And here's the thing. All right? What starts happening is this. Antoninus Pius eventually dies, and he is succeeded by a guy named Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius is a very interesting sort of character. All right? Very interesting sort of character because he also has his adoptive brother, a fellow named Lucius Verus. All right? And the idea was that Lucius Verus had military experience. He was really good at managing the military, and Marcus Aurelius has the political experience to manage domestic affairs here. Unfortunately, Verus wasn't actually very good at being a general, and this causes all sorts of problems. He does fight off the Parthians in 161 AD, but this was not easy. This is a real serious problem here. And we start having more problems. Those Germanic tribes start pressing in, and Verus dies in 169 AD. So that's the end of him, and Marcus Aurelius basically has to spend the rest of his reign running things himself, all right, up there on the north. And this is what he does here, what he does. And there are various political problems and political issues that come up here. For example, in 175 AD, there's a false report that Marcus Aurelius had died, and this causes all sorts of problems, an attempt to usurp the throne. Again, succession's always a problem in the Roman Empire here, and this gets really kind of messy. Now, here's the interesting thing. Marcus Aurelius is actually best known not so much for his political and military activities, but because we have his diaries. Now, I've been telling you guys that during this coronavirus outbreak, you should keep a diary. You should write down your thoughts, write down what goes on in your lives. Someday that will be really interesting historical information. But always remember, whatever you put in that diary will eventually be read by somebody else. All right? So you want to make sure that what you put in there is something you want your grandchildren to be able to read. All right? So that's something to keep in mind. Now, of course, it is true that after I'm dead, people read my diary, well, I'm dead, what do I care, right? There is that. But it will affect how you're remembered. And Marcus Aurelius was aware of this, and he didn't want people reading his personal diary, so he wrote it in Greek so that his Latin-speaking generals and this sort of thing, if they happened upon it, they couldn't read it. That was at least the theory. But of course, after he died, his diaries were found, and they have been read ever since. And he's kind of an interesting guy, because he's kind of a philosopher. He's a bit of a philosophical sort of fellow. And he's really kind of a well, not a grumpy, but a sort of a sad sort of guy in some ways. He's very preoccupied with his own thoughts. He's kind of melancholy a lot of time. He's kind of melancholy. He has a deep concern for the unity of all life. Kind of a philosopher in this way. All right? And that's something else you can write in your diary. You can write down your philosophical views. And who knows, someone someday might say, hey, that guy was really smart. She was really brilliant. Look at these neat ideas they wrote down. So it's not always a bad thing to have written a diary here. Marcus Aurelius wants to be a good person. He wants to be a good man, and he lives in an evil world, he says. How do I be a good person in an evil world? And this is a challenge many of us face. How do you be a good, moral human being in a world with all these terrible problems and terrible people running around doing all these terrible things? And this is what he struggles with. And he thinks about this, right? How do you be a good person and lead a good life in that environment? All right? Now, Marcus Aurelius was a good emperor. He was a very sharp guy, did a good job, managed the empire pretty well. But he did make one really, really serious mistake. And that mistake was he chose his successor badly. He chose his son, a fellow named Commodus, to be co-emperor. 3 years before he died, he says, okay, son, I'm going to make you co-emperor, and we are going to rule together, and you'll learn how to do it, and then everything will be fine, right? The problem was Commodus was really bad. He was not a good emperor at all, right? And the problem Commodus had is he'd been raised in a life of comfort and luxury, and he liked to party. That was his thing. He liked to have lots of parties and lots of fun here. He made peace along the frontiers of Rome so he could party more. Not because it was a good idea, but because he could then party more, all right? And this is what we start to see, all right? And he basically just has fun. That was his main thing. If you want to see him, he's actually been put in a Hollywood movie. The Emperor in the movie Gladiator. All right, the movie Gladiator is a lot of fun to watch because, of course, it displays the Roman gladiatorial arena really nicely, and it shows the excitement of gladiators and all this other stuff. And it's really a very fun movie to watch. And the bad emperor, the guy who in the end has to get killed in the movie, was Commodus. Now, Commodus didn't actually die in the gladiatorial arena. He, however, did do a very bad job. So that part of the movie is a lot of fun here. And of course, Commodus also made the one mistake we must always be careful of whenever we're dealing with politically powerful people, and that is he thought he was a god. Anytime anyone ever tells you they're a god and it's not April 1st, you need to call the funny farm because that person's lost their mind. All right, so that is an important thing to keep in mind. Commodus said, I am a god. I stand beside Jupiter. And this, of course, alienated everybody because people said, this guy's a nut. This guy is crazy. As a result, in 192 AD, they killed him. He was assassinated, taken out of the picture. All right, so he's gone. Well, of course, this is a problem because, again, succession was something the Romans never figured out how to quite handle. And so how do you handle succession? Well, there's another period of chaos. Various and sundry generals and powerful people are going to fight for the throne of the Roman Empire here. And a fellow named Septimus Severus, he came from Africa, a place called Leptis Magna, all right, which is a site I've never visited, but I've always wanted to go and see Leptis Magna. But a fellow named Septimus Severus takes control, and he gets a star. Okay, Septimus Severus gets himself a star. All right. Now, he was a very powerful guy, a very smart guy, and he generally did a good job here. All right. He did a good job, but it wasn't always easy. So Severus has to handle all the various problems. And one of the things he has to handle, of course, is Parthia. All right. The Parthian Persians are always pushing against the eastern border. So what he does is Severus attacks Parthia. All right. Now, at this point, Parthia is already having their own problems. They are very weak by this time. They're starting their decline. They're going to be gone soon. They won't last a lot longer here. All right. But there are lots and lots of problems in Rome too. And Septimus Severus had to defeat rivals. He's fighting the Parthians, and this gets pretty crazy. He does get control of several cities in the Parthian Empire, so he's pretty successful about this. But again, it's a tenuous kind of success. Now, Severus was a smart guy. He knew how to be both ruthless and generous, and this is an important point. If you want to succeed in this kind of an environment, the environment of political strong people, what you need to do is know when to be nice and know when to be harsh. Mix generosity with ruthlessness. And this is what he did, all right? He got the people of Rome on his side with all sorts of lavish donations, lots of exciting games and this sort of thing that got them happy. You want to keep those folks happy here. He also rebuilt his hometown of Leptis Magna, and of course, as a result, if you're able to go there, and I've never managed to get there myself in North Africa, you can go and see the ruins of Leptis Magna, which is interesting. And then, of course, he eventually dies. He was succeeded by his two sons. Now, his two sons are very interesting guys, all right? One of them is named Caracalla, the other is named Geta. Now, here's the thing. Those of you with siblings know that one of the things you do with siblings is you squabble. You fight. This is what you do when you have siblings. I have two brothers, and we squabbled when we were kids, and that's very normal. Well, our friend Caracalla and Geta squabbled too, but they took it too far. They hated each other. Oh my God, did they hate each other. They really hated each other. How much did they hate each other? In 212 AD, Geta was murdered by Caracalla, but not just Geta. 20,000 of Geta's followers were also murdered. Now that's taking sibling rivalry a long way. 20,000 dead people? Good Lord. All right, so this is what we see. Caracalla was not a good emperor. He wasn't very good at the job. He survives. He manages to struggle along until 217 AD. And what happened to him, well, because he didn't take my class, he made a terrible, horrible, awful mistake you must never make if you want to rule the Roman Empire, and that is, yes, he's killed. Here's what happened. He was out fighting on the eastern frontier, which is a place they often had to fight, and he stopped because he had to go to the toilet. He had to go to the bathroom. So he goes off to the bathroom, and he's going to the bathroom, and his own bodyguards came up behind him and killed him. Now, that's an ignominious way to go. You're going to the bathroom, and these guys come up behind you and chop you to pieces? But that's what happened to him, all right? That's what happened to him. Colorful way to go, I suppose. In any event, here's the thing. Severus's dynasty, his family, will rule Rome until 235 AD. Here's what happens. A nephew of Caracalla's takes the throne, but the real power actually is now in the hands of Grandma, the emperor's grandmother, one of these redoubtable old tough ladies who can't herself be emperor because the Romans are sexists, but she becomes the power behind the throne. All right? And an interesting young man comes along, and he's put in power, and his name is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but he's also known by the name Elagabalus. And Elagabalus is interesting because some people have argued, I've talked to various historians about this, and they say this guy was actually the most insane Roman emperor they ever had. Now that's a tall order because they had some nuts in that job, but this guy is called the craziest. Now, I don't know if that's entirely true. There's a lot of different theories about this. I've talked to people, a fellow down at Southern Connecticut State University, Byron Nakamura, who's an excellent, excellent professor and a very nice guy, and he's done a study of this guy, and he says, well, I don't know if he was that crazy, but he was definitely strange. And he was strange in a number of different ways. Some people have argued, I don't know if Byron Nakamura has said this, but I've heard this from others, and they have said that it's possible this guy was transgendered. This guy had really, really interesting, well, habits. And he was also named for the god he worshipped, which was his god from the east somewhere. And the god's name was Elagabalus. So if you look up Elagabalus, he gets a lot of negative attention here. He was bizarre. He was a strange young man. And the other problem was he was young, When you're a Roman emperor, you shouldn't be as young as this guy was. He was really just a teenager with absolute power. And so what he did is he had this interesting cult from somewhere in the east based upon apparently a meteor, and they worshipped the meteor. And this guy was, again, very strange guy. And he would do very strange things. And so people have said, well, he's the worst emperor ever. I don't know if he's the worst emperor, but he's definitely one of the strangest. And he lasts a few years, but then eventually his own grandmother had him killed. Now, you know you've hit bottom when grandma pops her own grandson. All right, that's what happens. All right, this guy is murdered by his own grandmother. Now, I don't think she actually did the killing, but she ordered the killing. So that was that. Another grandson is then put in place, and his name is Severus Alexander, and he's 13 years old. 13 years old? When I was 13, I could barely handle my allowance. Heck, the Roman Empire? Are you crazy, putting a 13-year-old in charge of the Roman Empire? But this is what they did. And this guy had some support from the army, but eventually they murdered him. The army decided he couldn't be done, and they killed him, and that was the end of that. All right? So he was taken out of the picture after a 13-year reign, so he was in his 20s, and the army finally said enough of this guy, and they killed him. And then, what's the term? The poo-poo hits the fan. All right? It all goes crazy then. Everything goes completely nuts. And the Roman Empire enters one of its greatest crises ever. This was a huge crisis that profoundly affected the history of Rome and the West and even the world. Okay? And basically what happened, you had 50 constant years of civil war, and it was ugly, it was nasty, it was messy. And when we pick up the Roman discussion and discussing Rome down the road, we'll talk about how they got out of this. But they went so close to collapse during this next 50 years, it was a disaster. But on that point, we're going to stop our discussion of Rome and turn our attention over to Persia, which is going to shift from the Parthians to the Sasanians, which is extremely interesting because it sets in motion some very interesting cultural and religious changes, which are also going to change the face of the world. And that's going to be quite interesting. So tune in next time for that.